The last thing filling their senses is perfume. Tons of flower petals cascade down from vents hidden in the ceiling. Silver goblets crash and break beneath the crushing avalanche. You open your mouth to cry for help, but pollen coats your throat before sound escapes. You are a decorated senator of Rome, a man who has led armies and written the laws of nations. And you are suffocating. A river of blossoms buries you alive. High above the gasping guests, a boy no older than 17 leans against a marble railing. He dabs at his eyes, but only because he is laughing too hard. He watches your body twist in the flowers. To him, your slow, gasping death is not an execution. It is the punchline of a joke only he understands. There are no soldiers here, no arena, no crowd demanding blood. This is dinner. And the boy, giggling at your final breath, wears the purple of the Caesars. The world still whispers about the flames Nero lit across his capital. The world still shudders at the madness of Caligula, but Rome itself tried to scrub this one out of memory, chisel him off every stone, tear his name from every record. His name was Elagabalus. He never dreamed of conquering new lands. He dreamed of something stranger, something darker. He wanted to take the mightiest empire the world had ever known and shape it into a toy box built only for him. What you are about to hear is the buried truth the Senate prayed would die with him. A story of absolute power dropped into the lap of a teenage boy with no conscience, and the cold, calculating woman standing behind the throne, pulling every string. Drop your city and country down in the comments. Take a second to hit subscribe and help this channel grow. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The ground of Mesopotamia soaked up the blood of a tyrant during the spring of 217 AD. Emperor Caracalla had ordered his column to stop along a sun-baked road so he could step aside and empty his bladder. One of his own soldiers walked up behind him and shoved steel between his ribs. The master of the known world collapsed, face down in the dust, dying with his tunic hiked up around his knees. That one small, humiliating knife thrust cracked open a void that would eventually devour the empire. The man behind the assassination, a paper-pushing prefect by the name of Macrinus, slipped into the emperor's place. He draped himself in the imperial purple. He addressed the legions. He believed he had locked the future of Rome into his own fist. He was catastrophically mistaken. Macrinus made one error. A single thread left loose, and it would unravel everything. He forgot to kill the dead emperor's women. When he looked at Julia Maesa, the aunt of the man he had just buried, he saw nothing but a tired grandmother dressed in black. He took away her imperial honors, but allowed her to keep every coin of her enormous ancestral treasury. He ordered her exiled back to her Syrian homeland, to the ancient city of Emesa. He thought he was being generous. That mercy would cost him his skull. Macrinus had no idea what kind of creature he was setting free. Julia Maesa was not a broken widow mourning a fallen house. She was a political predator of the highest order. She had spent decades prowling the halls of the Palatine, learning exactly how crowns are forged and exactly how they are shattered. She packed her caravan with chests of gold bars, heavy silver, and uncut gems. She left the capital looking like a defeated relic. The long journey east was not a retreat. It was reconnaissance. Emesa was a city of scorching heat and blistering devotion. It lay at the lip of the desert, roasting under a sun that never seemed to set. The streets carried the smell of myrrh, frankincense, and slow-cooking lamb. Rising above everything else was the great sanctuary of the sun deity, Elagabalus. Roman religion was all contract and cold marble. You handed Jupiter a slaughtered bull, and Jupiter handed you back a victory. The worship of Elagabalus ran on something far wilder. Their god was not a bearded statue standing in a colonnade. Their god was a fragment of heaven itself. Ages ago, a burning object had streaked down out of the night sky and buried itself in the sand. The priests had dug it out and installed it inside the temple. It became the physical body of the god on earth. A dark, conical stone, polished, strange, otherworldly. To the people of Syria, it was divinity made solid. To the Roman mind, it was a pagan absurdity carved out of space rubble. Julia Maeza had a grandson. He was 14 years old, and his name was Varius Avitus Bassianus. He served as the chief priest of that black stone. The world would come to remember him by the name of the deity he worshipped, a name that would become a curse whispered behind palace walls, Elagabalus. He did not move like a Roman. He did not carry himself like one. His eyes were painted thick with dark kohl. His robes shimmered with woven gold and deep violet silk. His crowns were loaded with pearls and gems that caught the desert light. Every morning he stepped into the temple courtyard and danced. He danced to the pounding of bronze cymbals and stretched hides. He spun and spun until his body entered a trance. And there, in that trance, he slit the throats of bulls and lambs in front of the black meteorite. His motion was liquid. His beauty was unsettling. Not far from the walls of the city, the Legio III Gallica had pitched camp. These were iron-hard Roman soldiers. They carried gladi forged for splitting men open at close range. They had been thousands of miles away from the rolling hills of home for too long. They were restless. They were angry. The new emperor, Macrinus, had slashed their bonuses and stripped away privileges they had fought for. Resentment simmered in every tent. When their shifts ended, the soldiers drifted into a mesa to drink and wander. They ended up at the edge of the temple courtyard, leaning on their spear shafts, watching the teenage priest dance. They were transfixed. The gold, the strange rites, the obscene, open wealth of the place. Julia Maeza watched the men watch her grandson. She read the look in their eyes. She already knew the oldest formula in Roman politics. Loyalty has a price, and that price is always written in coin. She began to redirect her fortune toward the legionary camp. Wagons loaded with silver rolled through the dark and unloaded at the barracks, while most of the garrison slept. The money came with a story. Maeza's agents moved tent by tent, planting a carefully engineered lie. They told the soldiers that the beautiful boy dancing in the temple was not merely a priest of some desert god. They told them he was the secret son of the murdered Caracalla. It was a masterpiece of a lie. The army had adored Caracalla. He had slept on the ground beside them, marched beside them, and made them rich. They loathed Macrinus, that soft bureaucrat playing dress-up on the throne. They remembered the easy gold of the old regime. Maeza offered them a second chance at that life. Back the boy, and the rivers of silver would never run dry again. The soldiers squinted at the dancing teenager. There was a faint family resemblance if you wanted to see it. That was enough. Truth did not matter in the desert. The coins on the table were real. On the night of May 15, 218 AD, the legionary gates swung silently open. The soldiers smuggled the boy and his grandmother inside the walls. When the sun cleared the horizon the next morning, the Legio III Gallica lifted their shields and proclaimed the 14-year-old priest the true emperor of Rome. News of the mutiny spread through the east, like fire in dry grass. Other legions, hungry for the promised payments, cut down their officers and shouted their allegiance to the boy. Macrinus was in Antioch, only a few hundred miles away, when the reports reached him. The color drained from his face. He understood what his mercy had just cost him. He frantically stitched together a loyal force to crush the uprising before it could breathe. He sent his cavalry commander, Ulpius Julianus, to smash the rebel stronghold. Julianus expected to slaughter a pack of disorganized Easterners in robes. He led his men up to the walls of Emesa and prepared to overrun them. But the defense of that camp was not being directed by a grizzled general. It was being run by an old woman on the parapet. Julia Maesa stood up on the wall in full view, hurling bags of pure gold down at the attacking line. She shouted over the ringing of iron, promising them twice whatever Macrinus was paying. 3 times, 4 times, the attacking line splintered. They did not run. They did something far worse for the empire. They turned around, cut down their own commander Julianus, hacked off his head, and carried it back to the boy emperor as a gift. The siege dissolved into a mass defection. The rebel army doubled in a single afternoon. Macrinus had no more generals to send. He had to march himself. The 2 armies crashed together on the dusty flats outside the village of Emei, near Antioch, on June 8, 218 AD. It was a savage, confused slaughter of Roman against Roman. The Praetorian Guard of Macrinus locked shields and drove forward. They were the best soldiers in the world. The rebel infantry staggered backward under the pressure. Shields wavered, swords dropped. Men at the edges began peeling off and sprinting for the rear. The rebellion was one hard push away from being wiped out in the mud. Then, the doors of the imperial litters swung open. Julia Maesa and her daughter, Julia Soaemias, jumped down into the massacre. These were women who had spent their lives on silken couches, in scented bathhouses, on polished marble. They threw themselves directly into the blood-soaked retreating line. They grabbed fleeing legionaries by the leather straps of their armor. They screamed into their faces. They shamed them. They pointed toward the advancing enemy wall. Behind them, the 14-year-old emperor drew his sword. He kicked his horse forward and rode straight into the heart of the fighting. The sight of the noble women in the filth and the boy on horseback at the front of the line ignited something frantic in the rebel ranks. They rallied. They surged back into the Praetorians. The line held. The tide reversed. Macrinus watched his elite crack and buckle. He lost his nerve. He tore off the purple cloak, shaved his beard in a tent to hide his face, and rode out of the battle like a common deserter. His army surrendered on the field. The empire now belonged to a child. Macrinus was caught a few days later trying to slip across the Bosphorus. The soldiers threw him into a wagon and dragged him back toward Syria. He never arrived. Somewhere on the road, they killed him and rolled his body into a ditch. The road to Rome was open, but Julia Maesa was too disciplined to sprint. The boy had to be established. The Senate had to be conditioned. The enormous administrative machine of the empire had to absorb its new master. The imperial court halted for the winter of 218 AD in the city of Nicomedia in Asia Minor. Nicomedia was where the boy's true face began to show through the mask. The strings of the puppet began to snap. Up to this point, he had been a symbol, a banner his grandmother waved in front of angry men with swords. But absolute power acts like a drug in a teenage bloodstream. The boy understood now that he was no longer some provincial priest. He was a living god in the flesh. Men who had led armies now pressed their foreheads to the marble at his feet. He started to test how much he could get away with. His first victim was a man called Ganys. Ganys was a tutor, a battlefield commander, and a loyal servant of the family. He was the one who had directed the rebel troops on the plain at Antioch. He was the man who had physically handed the throne to the boy. Ganys believed in the old ways. He kept trying to shape the teenager into a proper emperor. He suggested he read the law codes. He urged him to listen to his advisors. Elagabalus had no interest in law codes. During a council meeting in front of the entire court, the boy exploded. He pulled a dagger from his belt. He lunged across the room and rammed the blade into the chest of his tutor. The guards stood locked in place, unsure what to do. The emperor calmly ordered them to finish it. They fell on Ganys and cut him apart on the mosaic floor. The message was pure and clear. The boy could not be handled. While slaves scrubbed blood out of the floor tiles in Nicomedia, Elagabalus turned his attention west, toward Rome itself. The Senate was a brotherhood of ancient patricians. They traced their bloodlines back to the Republic and beyond. They were men of grim, severe pride. They wore plain wool togas with narrow purple stripes. They hated the East. They hated display. The emperor decided to introduce himself in his own way. He commissioned an enormous, full-length portrait of himself. The painting did not show him in the armor of a conquering general. It showed him in the full extravagance of his priesthood. A massive jeweled tiara, robes threaded with gold, necklaces stacked on necklaces, rings on every finger, eyes outlined in black. He ordered the painting shipped to Rome and mounted in the Senate chamber, directly above the statue of the goddess Victoria. Victoria was the embodiment of Roman conquest. Every senator who entered that hall to debate the business of the empire now had to burn incense and pour wine to a portrait of a teenage boy dressed like an Eastern queen. It was a cold, deliberate strike. It was the staking of a claim. He was bending the oldest institution in the Western world to kneel inside his private religion before he even set foot on Italian soil. The senators swallowed their nausea. They burned the incense. They voted him every title he asked for. The cage was closing. In the summer of 219 AD, the imperial caravan finally reached the walls of Rome. The entire city emptied into the streets to see him arrive. Citizens packed the rooftops until the tiles groaned. Senators lined the road in their best white wool. The Praetorian Guard stood rigid at attention. They were expecting the familiar scene. A young conqueror riding a triumphal chariot, waving to the thunder of applause. That is not what they got. The procession was an attack on every sense. The air thickened with burning cedar and imported incenses no one in the city could name. Drummers hammered out pulsing, alien rhythms. Women in translucent veils clashed cymbals and danced barefoot over the hot stones. And then, the centerpiece. A massive chariot plated in solid gold, studded with rubies and emeralds. It was pulled by 6 flawless white stallions, but there was no driver. There were no human passengers. Strapped upright at the center of that golden frame was the black meteorite from Emesa. The stone had been hauled across continents. Now it sat there in the Roman sunlight, jagged and ancient. The Emperor of Rome was not riding in the chariot. He was walking in front of it. Elagabalus wore robes of spun gold and violet silk that dragged through the dust of the city. His tiara threw sunlight into the eyes of anyone who looked at him. He did not look at Rome. He walked backward. He refused to turn his back on the god. For miles, through the winding streets, past the ancient temples, up the sacred hills, the master of the world shuffled in reverse. He held the reins loosely, his gaze nailed to the black rock. The crowd went silent. There was no cheering. There were only the drums and the steady clop of hooves on stone. The senators watched their emperor trip backward past the monuments of their great-grandfathers. They saw the thick paint on his face. They saw the feverish devotion burning in his eyes. The wealth of the empire, the command of the legions, the power of life and death over millions, all of it was now held by a teenager who answered to a silent piece of space debris. Julia Maisa rode behind him with a face carved out of stone. She had won. She had put her grandson on the throne. But as she watched him waltz backward through her capital, a slow, icy fear began to settle into her chest. The boy was no longer performing a role. He believed he actually was a god. And a god does not ask permission before burning everything around him. The procession reached the top of the Palatine Hill. The bronze doors of the imperial palace groaned open. The stone was carried inside. The boy followed. The doors slammed shut behind them. Rome was trapped. The greatest war machine humanity had ever built had just been seized by a cult. The senators went home to their estates without speaking. The soldiers walked back to their barracks. The city sat there baking in the summer heat, waiting to see what the morning would bring. They had been promised a ruler. What they had received was a parasite. The long, dark winter of the Severan dynasty had begun, and the first act of the nightmare was already playing out behind the palace walls. The boy began to issue decrees. He ordered the construction of a new temple up on the Palatine itself. It would not be for Jupiter. It would be for the meteorite. And he ordered that the most sacred relics of the Roman state be brought to him at once. He was going to pull the soul out of the city, piece by piece. The sacred fire of Vesta was still burning in the Forum. It was tended day and night by the Vestal virgins. It had burned without interruption for centuries. It was the spiritual heartbeat of the empire. So long as that flame burned, Rome was believed to stand. Elagabalus sent his guards into the sanctuary. They shoved past the terrified priestesses. They seized the sacred flame. They seized the palladium, the ancient carved wooden image of Minerva that legend said Aeneas himself had dragged out of burning Troy. They carried these holy objects up the hill and placed them under the shadow of the black rock. The boy emperor declared by decree that every other god in Rome was now nothing more than a servant of Elagabal. The ancient religion of the Roman people was reduced to a footnote by imperial command. The patricians wept in their private rooms. The common people muttered in the taverns. The tension in the capital was winding tighter by the day. The boy was pulling the pillars out from under their reality, one at a time, and laughing while it all groaned. His court filled up with the strange and the depraved. He dismissed the veteran administrators and generals his grandmother had placed around him. He handed out the highest offices in the empire, based entirely on physical attributes and on who had pleased him most in his private chambers the night before. A stage dancer was appointed commander of the Praetorian Guard. A chariot racer was handed control of the grain supply for the city. The Senate was forced to rubber stamp every single one of these appointments. Men who had spent 40 years studying the law and leading legions now had to take their orders from actors and athletes. The humiliation was not accidental. It was engineered. It was designed to crush the spine of the old nobility. He was showing them, day after day, that their ancestors, their dignity, and even their lives were nothing more than toys in his hand. Rome had survived mad emperors before. Caligula had threatened to make his horse a consul. Nero had forced senators to sit in silence while he played the lyre and cried. But Elagabalus was a different breed of madman. His madness was not just erratic. It was theological. He was trying to rewrite the spiritual DNA of the empire itself. He ordered the citizens of Rome to take up his Eastern customs. Men of rank were told to put away their togas and wear long flowing robes. They were pressured into painting their eyes with kohl. The rigid masculine backbone of the capital was put through a forced, deliberate softening. The boy ridiculed their stoicism openly. He sneered at their austerity. He surrounded himself with eunuchs, dancers, and flatterers. The palace became a maze of silk and incense, where one wrong glance at the wrong moment could end a life. Even his mother, Julia Soamius, threw herself into the madness. She loved every second of it. She founded a kind of women's senate up on the Quirinal Hill, where she issued rulings on fashion, on etiquette, on who could sit where and who could not. She rode through the streets in gilded carriages, making a public show of her power over the wives of the patricians. She encouraged her son's worst instincts. Together, mother and son turned the imperial court into a traveling circus of grotesques. The treasury was drained to pay for endless festivals. Ships arrived every day at the port of Ostia, carrying exotic beasts, foreign spices, and crates of gold that vanished into the palace. The granaries wavered. The food supply jittered. The delicate internal organs of the empire were beginning to fail under the pressure. As the months rolled by, the novelty hardened into a slow, suffocating dread. The boy's behavior was becoming more erratic, not less. He spent his days in the temple, slaughtering hundreds of cattle and sheep, sinking his arms into their guts to the elbow, reading omens in the steam. He wandered the palace corridors at night, looking for fresh ways to test the obedience of the men around him. He was hunting for the outer edge of human endurance. He wanted to find the exact pressure point where the men who ran the world would finally crack. He wanted to see the precise moment dignity died in their eyes, and they became animals begging him for another minute of life. Before we step into the private banquet halls of the emperor, pause. What you are listening to is not legend. This is the documented reality of what human beings become when every consequence is stripped away. This level of investigative storytelling takes hundreds of hours of research, translating ancient sources and stitching together the timeline of terror. We do not answer to algorithms. We answer to you. Join the inner circle of this channel. Become a member of the lineage. By joining our ranks, you are not simply supporting a video. You are becoming one of us. You become a guardian of the dark past, making sure these stories are pulled out of the shadows and delivered with the uncompromising quality you expect. Members of the lineage get early access, exclusive debriefs, and a permanent place in our community of history enthusiasts. Hit the join button below and take your place in the ranks. The boy emperor grew bored of his public spectacles. The streets were too loud. The temple rituals were too predictable. He wanted something more intimate, something closer, where he could feel the fear breathing on his skin. He began to send out invitations, thick parchment scrolls, hand-delivered, sealed with the imperial ring. Invitations to dine privately with the god emperor inside his own banquet halls. To receive one of those scrolls was to hold a death sentence wrapped in silk ribbon. The most powerful men in Rome opened those letters with shaking fingers. They knew that the second the bronze doors of that banquet hall sealed behind them, Roman law no longer applied in that room. They were walking into a void where the only rule was whatever a 14-year-old boy dreamed up next. The feasts were about to begin. And the main course, every single time, was terror. The parchment felt unnaturally heavy in their hands. It was rolled tight and sealed shut with dark red wax, stamped with the mark of the imperial signet. A courier from the Palatine had delivered it silently in the middle of the night, slipping it into the household and vanishing before a single slave could ask his name. It was an invitation to dine with the emperor. For a senator of Rome, holding that letter was the same as holding a signed order for his own funeral. You could not turn it down. Pretending to be sick was read as treason. Running from the city meant your wife, your children, your cousins, and your grandchildren would be butchered by dawn. You had no choice but to wash, drape yourself in your finest white toga, climb the marble steps of the palace, and walk willingly into the cage with the animal. The dining hall was a masterwork of engineered intimidation. Thousands of oil lamps flickered across walls plated in solid gold, sending long fingers of shadow stretching across the ceiling. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, clogged with imported myrrh and smoldering cedar. The heat was not accidental. It was deliberate. It was designed to make the guests sweat through their togas, to make their hands tremble, to drain them before the first course was even served. Elagabalus sat at the head of the room on a raised platform, wrapped in violet silk, his eyelids painted heavy with black coal. He did not eat with his guests. He sat there above them and watched. He watched like a man studying insects pinned to a board. The servants glided forward, carrying silver platters sealed beneath polished, domed lids. The senators straightened their backs, trying to look composed, preparing themselves for the imperial feast. The lids were lifted in unison. Underneath were roasted boars, glistening with fat, tiny songbirds arranged in perfect rows, fruits so ripe they seemed to glow. The senators leaned in and reached for the food. One of them pressed a small knife into a roasted apple. The blade snapped clean in half. Another senator closed his teeth over a purple grape. It cracked between his molars, and his mouth filled with blood and the taste of ground glass. The entire banquet was a hoax. The meat had been carved out of cedar wood and painted with rendered animal fat to give it the glistening sheen of roasting flesh. The fruit was blown glass. The bread was fired clay. The senators sat there with their gums splitting and their stomachs twisting. They were not allowed to stop. For hours, they had to keep up the performance of chewing and swallowing. They had to lift their cups toward the dais and shout out their gratitude for the greatest meal of their entire lives. If a single sigh of annoyance escaped, if one man let his mask slip for even a second, a Praetorian standing in the shadows behind his couch would quietly slide a gladius out of its sheath and set the cold flat of the blade against the back of his neck. This was not a boyish prank. This was the precise, clinical stripping away of identity. These were the men who wrote the laws governing 50 million people. They owned estates spread across 3 continents. They sent legions into battle with the flick of a wrist. And here, under the dim golden light of the imperial palace, they were being forced to eat dirt and smile while a 14-year-old studied their humiliation. He was demonstrating a hard truth about the species. Dignity is a luxury. It disintegrates the moment survival is on the table. When actual food was finally served, it was an obscenity against nature itself. The boy demanded dishes that required the slaughter of thousands of animals for a single mouthful. Servants brought out silver bowls heaped only with the brains of flamingos. They served platters of crushed camel heels. They served lentils tossed with polished onyx stones and peas mixed with grains of solid gold. The senators had to swallow the stones whole, risking a torn intestine because spitting them back out would insult their host and end their lives. The emperor himself picked at the tongues of peacocks and nightingales. He drank wine laced with crushed pearls. He was literally eating the treasury of the empire, while the men who had built it cracked their teeth on gravel. The psychological torture reached far past the dining tables. As the night dragged on, the wine kept flowing. The servants had been ordered to lace the amphorae with powerful narcotics imported from the eastern provinces. The senators, already exhausted and half-starved, eventually lost their grip on consciousness. They collapsed one by one onto the velvet cushions of their couches. A decorated military tribune, a veteran who had survived the brutal winter campaigns against the Germanic tribes on the Rhine, surfaced from the drugged sleep hours later. Every oil lamp had been snuffed out. The room was drowning in darkness. The air had changed. It smelled now of raw meat and the musk of unwashed fur. The tribune felt a pressing weight across his chest. He cracked his eyes open. In the thin slice of moonlight coming through the high windows, he saw the silhouette of a fully grown African leopard sprawled across his ribs, its massive paws draped over his shoulders. The emperor had ordered his animal handlers to release his tamed predators into the hall, while the guests lay drugged and unconscious. The animals had been fed earlier in the evening, which meant they were not actively hunting, but they were still wild beasts hardwired for the kill. The tribune's heart slammed against his sternum. He understood instantly that a single sudden movement, one panicked intake of breath, might trip the predator reflex. Those jaws could crush his windpipe in less than a second. He also knew he had a bone-handled dagger tucked inside his tunic. He could drive it into the animal's throat, but killing the emperor's pet meant the guards outside the doors would peel his skin off in strips before sunrise. The old soldier did not move. He did not even blink. He regulated his breath, feeling the hot, damp exhalation of the cat washing over his cheek. He lay there, trapped under the weight of the beast for hours, soaking through his tunic, his muscles knotting into screaming cramps. And from somewhere on the dark balcony above the floor, a soft, rhythmic giggle floated down through the silence. Elagabalus was up there in the shadows, watching, feeding off the paralysis of men who had once commanded armies. During daylight hours, the theater spilled out of the palace and into the streets of Rome. The emperor organized his own chariot races. He refused to use horses. Instead, he ordered his guards to round up the highest-born matriarchs of the patrician families. These were women whose lineages stretched directly back to the founders of the Republic. They were the moral spine of the aristocracy, the grandmothers who held entire houses together with iron dignity. Elagabalus had them stripped naked in the palace courtyard, in front of his entire court. He had leather harnesses buckled across their bare shoulders. Then he hitched them to the golden frame of his chariot like livestock. He climbed aboard. He took the reins in one hand and a braided leather whip in the other, and he drove the screaming, bleeding women through the cobblestone streets of the capital. The people of Rome stood up on their balconies and watched the foundation of their civilization dragged face first through the filth. The women stumbled, scraping their knees raw, tearing skin off their palms, leaving smears of blood across the stones. Elagabalus cracked the whip across their backs, driving the grandmothers of the Senate like draft animals. The city stood in stunned, total silence. No one moved. No one intervened. The mob understood in that moment what it meant. If the emperor could do this publicly to the untouchable elite, then there was nothing left in Roman law capable of protecting a common citizen. The random nature of his cruelty was what sharpened its edge. During his banquets, he introduced a lottery. Servants would slip small wooden tokens beneath the cushions of the guests. At the close of the night, every man had to pull out his token and claim his prize. The prizes were exercises in pure emotional whiplash. One senator drew his token and was presented with a polished chest holding 10 pounds of solid silver. The man on the couch beside him drew his token and was handed a wooden box stuffed with 100 living vipers that began to pour out over his hands. Another man drew his token and was given a dead, rotting street dog, which he was forced to carry on his shoulder through the city all the way back to his estate while the mob jeered. Another drew his token and was handed a sealed decree in the emperor's own hand, ordering the immediate execution of his firstborn son. The emperor leaned forward from the dais and studied their faces as they read. He was cataloging the exact micro-expression where relief collapsed into grief. But grinding the aristocracy into the dirt was not enough. To truly own the empire, Elagabalus had to rip out its soul. He turned next to the Atrium Vestae, the house of the Vestal Virgins in the Roman Forum. The Vestals were the religious heart of the Roman state. They were 6 priestesses chosen before the age of 10, whose single duty was to guard the sacred flame of Vesta. The Romans believed, with their entire being, that if that fire ever went out, the city itself would fall. The priestesses served for 30 years under an absolute vow of chastity. They were the only women in Rome entirely free from the authority of a father or a husband. They were untouchable by law and by custom. To harm a Vestal was a crime against the gods. If a Vestal broke her vow, she was not executed by the sword. Roman law required something far worse. She was bound in chains, stripped of her sacred robes, carried through the city on a funeral bier while the population wept, and then lowered into an underground chamber dug near the Colline Gate. She was given a single loaf of bread, a small oil lamp, and a jug of water. Then the entrance was sealed with dirt, and the city walked away. She starved to death in the dark, alone, because Roman superstition forbade the spilling of her holy blood. Elagabalus had no fear of Roman law. He had total contempt for Roman gods. He viewed the idea of lifelong celibacy as a personal insult to the fertility rites of his Syrian sun god. He sent a unit of his personal guards straight into the forum. They kicked the doors of the sanctuary off their hinges. They shoved past the screaming novice priestesses and seized the chief Vestal herself, a woman named Aquilia Severa. They dragged the highest-ranking priestess in all of Rome up the Palatine Hill and threw her down on the polished marble of the imperial throne room. Elagabalus summoned the Senate on the spot. The old men came running, pale, trembling, bracing themselves for a mass execution. Instead, the teenage emperor rose to his feet and calmly announced that he was taking Aquilia Severa as his legal wife. The room went completely still. The air itself seemed to stop. This was theological suicide. This was the ultimate blasphemy against everything the city stood for. The emperor smiled at the frozen faces in front of him. He explained, with the pleasant tone of a boy explaining a game, that the union of a high priest and a high priestess would produce children with the blood of gods in their veins. He forced the ceremony through. He dragged her into his private chambers personally, and he violated, physically and spiritually, the single institution that had held the spine of the empire upright for centuries. The city of Rome waited for the sky to crack open. They waited for Jupiter to reach down and split the palace with a bolt of lightning, burning the boy to a black smear on the marble. A day passed. The sun rose and set. Then another day. Then another. The sky stayed clear. The stars did not fall. The psychological effect was total. The gods had not come. The ancient covenant between Rome and heaven had been broken in public, and the heavens had answered with silence. The people began to understand, quietly at first, and then with a sick, sinking certainty, that the sky was empty. The only god left was the teenager on the hill. His obsession with inverting nature finally turned back on his own body. He began to despise the form he had been born into. He spent his days wandering the palace corridors, wearing nothing but a woven net across his hips, performing public acts with his chariot drivers in front of his slaves. He summoned the finest surgeons from Alexandria and Athens, and had them brought to the capital under guard. He stood before them naked, and offered half of the gold in the imperial treasury to any one of them who could surgically alter his anatomy to give him the physical shape of a woman. The surgeons looked at their scalpels, looked at the boy, and refused. They understood exactly what ancient surgery would do to him. He would hemorrhage to death on the table within minutes, or rot out with infection within a week. And when he died, they would be crucified in the forum before his body had even cooled. Furious at the limits of medicine, Elagabalus decided that blood would have to substitute for flesh. He ordered his Syrian priests to castrate themselves in front of the black meteorite. The white marble floors of the Palatine Temple ran sticky and dark with the blood of fanatics, cutting pieces off their own bodies to soothe the manic impulses of a teenage boy. If you want to truly understand how a civilization stands by and permits this level of systemic rot, you have to go to the source. The book we built the foundation of this script from is available right now through the View Products button on your screen. It is a monolithic archive of terror. It pulls back the curtain on the Roman records to expose the exact mechanics of how tyrants dismantle republics from the inside. You need to own this text if you want to grasp the real depth of the madness we are walking you through. Beside it on the shelf, you will find a curated collection of dark artifacts. Open the shelf now. Explore the memorabilia, waiting to complete your collection while we continue descending into the final act. A 14-year-old boy does not have the mental architecture for foresight. He was so absorbed in inventing fresh ways to humiliate the Senate that he forgot to look behind him. He forgot the oldest rule of the Roman world. Emperors are not kept on the throne by gods. Emperors are kept on the throne by men with swords. The Praetorian Guard, those same elite soldiers who had mutinied in the Syrian desert and lifted the boy to power in the first place, now stood watch in the palace corridors. They were hardened professional killers. They had fought on the Parthian border. They had bled on the cold moors of Britannia. They had backed the boy because his grandmother had promised them endless rivers of gold. But the gold had long ago lost its shine. Now they were forced to stand at attention while a painted adolescent danced backward in front of a rock, whipped patrician grandmothers through the streets, and fed decorated senators to leopards for entertainment. The shame was starting to rot through the bribes. The guards looked at the boy and no longer saw a divine ruler. They saw a problem. They saw a liability wearing a crown. And they were not the only ones seeing it. Deep inside the private quarters of the palace, surrounded by ledgers, maps, and spies, Julia Maesa sat in total silence. The mastermind who had engineered the entire takeover, the architect of the empire's current nightmare, finally understood that her creation had slipped the leash completely. The boy was generating too much hatred, from too many directions at once. He was uniting the Senate, the streets, and the legions under a single shared disgust. He was about to get the entire family slaughtered. The grandmother looked down at the pieces on the board. She had moved them all herself. She had placed the king. Now she did the math one more time, cold and clean. The leash was broken. The dog had to be put down. Julia Maesa did not run on a grandmother's instinct. She ran on the cold arithmetic of Roman survival. She sat alone in a shadowed wing of the Palatine Palace, candles burning low, and began to calculate the exact expiration date of her own bloodline. The reports flowing in from the streets left no room for interpretation. The Senate had been broken in half. The plebeians were hungry. The Praetorian Guard, the very men whose swords kept the crown on her grandson's head, were now watching that grandson sell his body in the taverns of the capital after dark. Maesa had seen this pattern before. These were the unmistakable tremors of a dying regime. She had built the rise of Elagabalus by selling him to the legions as a god. Now she understood, with total clarity, that she had to dismantle him before the legions decided to burn the entire imperial family down to ash. She needed a new product. She did not have to look far. In the adjacent wing of the same palace, her other daughter, Julia Mamaea, was raising a son of her own, a boy named Alexander Severus. He was 13 years old. He was everything his cousin Elagabalus was not. Alexander did not wear silk. He did not smear coal across his eyelids. He studied geometry late into the night. He recited the old Roman law codes from memory. He trained with wooden swords in the inner courtyards. Maesa looked at the boy and saw the perfect replacement ready to be sold to an exhausted empire. She saw a return to the old ways. She saw sanity wrapped in a toga. The swap required delicate surgery, not force. Maesa waited for one of the rare windows when her grandson was lucid, and she moved in slowly. She spoke to his fanaticism, not his reason. She whispered that the grinding paperwork of running an empire was beneath the dignity of the chief priest of the sun god. She suggested that he formally adopt his younger cousin and bestow upon him the title of Caesar. That way, Alexander could handle the dull, earthly labor of signing decrees and counting grain shipments, while the emperor himself was freed to commit entirely to his sacred rites. Elagabalus, wrapped in his own fog of delusion, agreed on the spot. In the summer of 221 AD, he signed the adoption papers for his 13-year-old cousin with his own hand. He had just signed the first page of his own death warrant. The instant Alexander was presented to the public, the loyalty of Rome shifted beneath their feet, like a breaking shelf of ice. The Praetorians saw a boy who actually looked and moved like a proper Roman noble. The Senate saw a figure they could steer with argument, rather than bend with fear. Cheers for the young Caesar rolled across the forum like a wave. Elagabalus heard those cheers from his balcony above the city. The sound cut through the narcotic haze he lived inside. And for all his madness, Elagabalus still had the animal cunning of a cornered predator. He understood, immediately, exactly what his grandmother had done. She had boxed him in. He was no longer the only door through which power flowed. There was a rival breathing down the hall. And the rival was loved. The palace split into two armed camps overnight. Elagabalus ordered the instant execution of his cousin. He dispatched his own personal guards into Alexander's chambers with daggers drawn and cups of poisoned wine. They arrived to find the doors bolted shut from within, and a wall of armored Praetorians standing shoulder to shoulder in front of them. Julia Maesa had already moved. She had quietly paid off the inner circle of the guard, buying a permanent ring of steel around the young Caesar. She restricted his diet to food prepared only by his own mother, tested for poison before he ever touched it. She sealed off his entire wing of the palace. The supreme ruler of the known world suddenly discovered that he was entirely incapable of murdering a 13-year-old boy living under the same roof. Frustration rotted into pure mania. If Elagabalus could not kill him in the shadows, he would destroy him in the daylight. He marched into the Senate House himself, robes dragging behind him, and stood in front of the assembled patricians. The old men sat rigid on their wooden benches, togas stained with soot from the morning sacrifices. The emperor demanded, on the spot, that they draft a decree stripping Alexander of the title of Caesar. He demanded they formally declare the boy an enemy of the state. The Senate did not respond. No one moved. No one reached for a stylus. Every man in that room calculated the same equation and arrived at the same impossible answer. To agree meant civil war. To refuse meant immediate execution on the floor. The silence in the marble hall became a physical weight. Elagabalus began to scream, spraying spit across the front rows. He screamed himself hoarse. And still no one lifted a stylus. Finally, the emperor turned and stormed out of the chamber. His next move was colder. He ordered his agents to scatter through the city and plant a rumor in every neighborhood. The young Caesar, they whispered, had been struck down by a sudden, violent illness. He was dying. Elagabalus wanted to run an experiment. He wanted to see whether Rome would weep or revolt. The answer came back within the hour. The Castra Praetoria was the fortified military compound squatting just outside the city walls, home to thousands of the empire's most dangerous soldiers. The moment the rumor of Alexander's illness reached the barracks, the place detonated. These men had sold their honor to put a foreign priest on the throne, and they now saw Alexander as their only route back to self-respect. They strapped on their iron armor. They gripped their shields. They refused to muster for normal duties. They rioted inside their own walls, hammering the butts of their spears against the stone, demanding proof that the boy was alive. They sent a messenger galloping up to the palace with a short, simple ultimatum. "Bring the Caesar to us, breathing, or we will tear the Palatine Hill down to bare rock." Elagabalus broke. The illusion of his absolute authority cracked clean down the middle. He was a teenager who had been playing God for years, and the men holding the actual weapons had just reminded him of how his own throat worked. On March 11th, 222 AD, he made his last desperate move to hold the empire together. He ordered the golden chariot prepared. He gathered his mother, Julia Soaemias, and his young cousin, Alexander. Together, under a pale morning sky, the three of them rolled out of the palace gates and made their way across the city to the towering brick walls of the Praetorian camp. The gates parted. The imperial chariot rolled into the vast central courtyard. What waited inside was staggering. Thousands of legionaries stood packed in perfect formation, rank after rank, helmet after helmet. The afternoon sun flared across a frozen ocean of polished iron. Their spears stood straight up, motionless. Elagabalus stepped down from the chariot. His heavy violet robes dragged in the dust. He lifted his hand, expecting the traditional imperial salute. He expected the thunder of swords striking shields. He expected the roar of obedience. He got nothing. Silence. Thousands of pairs of eyes stared right through him. And then, slowly, those eyes drifted. They slid past the emperor and locked onto the 13-year-old Alexander. One soldier in the back broke the quiet with a shout for the young Caesar. Another joined in. Then 100. Then 1,000. In the span of a few heartbeats, the entire courtyard was shaking with the deafening chant of Alexander's name. The legions ignored the supreme ruler of the Roman world as if he were a statue. They looked through him like he was already dead. The humiliation was beyond anything a mind like his could accept. Elagabalus demanded silence. He ordered the commanders of the guard to arrest the men who had started the cheering. He ordered the cheerleaders dragged to the center of the courtyard and executed on the spot for treason. It was the final, fatal miscalculation. The oldest law of empire snapped into focus in that instant. An emperor whose commands cannot be enforced is not an emperor. He is just a man shouting into the wind. The Praetorian commanders did not draw their swords to make the arrests. They drew their swords and turned the blades toward the emperor. The cheering collapsed into a low, menacing silence. The trap closed. The formations broke, and the soldiers began to advance across the courtyard as one. And at that moment, finally, the reality of death arrived inside the boy's mind. The religious visions evaporated. The golden halos and sun chariots he had seen around his own head, his entire adult life snapped out of existence. He was not a god. He was meat. Elagabalus turned and ran. He fled across the hard-packed dirt of the courtyard, his heavy silk robes catching at his ankles, tangling his sprint. His mother, the woman who had fed and encouraged every twisted instinct in him, ran behind him. Mother and son sprinted blindly through the maze of the military camp, hunting for any door that led outside. Behind them, closing steadily, came the rhythmic metallic pounding of hobnailed boots on stone. The hunt was on. They ducked through the first open doorway they found. It was a latrine. A Roman military latrine was a crude marvel of engineering. A long stone bench ran down the wall, pierced with round holes. Beneath the bench, a deep trench carried a steady flow of water out toward the main sewer lines, flushing away the waste of hundreds of men. The air inside that stone room was thick with the stench of feces and stale piss. This was the final hiding place of the ruler of the civilized world. The soldiers followed the panicked footprints through the dirt. They arrived at the latrine entrance. They did not charge in. They stepped into the dim light calmly, in no hurry at all, and they looked down at the holes in the bench. Elagabalus had climbed down into the running trench. The boy who had demanded his food be dusted with flakes of gold, the emperor who wore pearls sewn onto his shoes and bathed in rivers of imported perfume, was now crouched chest-deep in raw sewage. He had smeared human waste across his face and his silk robes, praying that the darkness and the filth would hide him. His mother crouched beside him, shaking uncontrollably up to her ribs in the foul water. The Praetorians stepped up to the row of holes. They did not speak. There were no grand speeches. No one declared the Republic restored. No one read out a charge. They simply unclipped their gladi from their belts. The gladius was a short, heavy, brutal blade, forged for stabbing at arm's length, and they stepped down into the pit. They killed the mother first. Julia Soamius lunged forward, throwing herself across her son in a final reflex of motherhood, and a soldier drove his blade clean through her chest. She folded into the running water without a sound and was swept a few feet downstream before her body caught against the stone. Elagabalus screamed. He scrambled backward and pressed himself into the corner of the trench wall. A legionary reached down, grabbed him by his oiled, perfumed hair, yanked his head back, and drove the iron point straight through his throat. The emperor choked on his own blood and on the sewage of the very men he had once commanded. He died at 18 years old, trembling in the dark, drowning in filth. State violence requires a visible end. The soldiers hauled the two corpses up out of the trench. They stripped off the waterlogged, ruined silk and threw the naked bodies of the emperor and his mother down into the dirt of the courtyard. They lashed thick hemp ropes around their ankles. The gates of the Castra Praetoria swung wide. A detachment of guards pulled the corpses behind them out into the streets of Rome. The news of the assassination ran ahead of the procession. By the time the soldiers reached the inner districts, an enormous crowd had already gathered. These were the same citizens who had swallowed years of his chariot races, his purges, his public obscenities. They lined the cobblestones shoulder to shoulder. They watched the ruined bodies bounce and scrape across the stones. They did not stay silent. The mob broke onto the corpses. They threw rocks. They spat on the dead emperor's face. They kicked at his ribs. The physical destruction of his body was the only way Rome knew how to claw back the dignity he had spent years stripping from them. The procession reached the Roman Forum. The soldiers tried to shove the corpse of Elagabalus headfirst down an open grate into the Cloaca Maxima, the giant sewer that ran beneath the heart of the capital. They wanted him to rot in the dark, swept out to the sea with the rest of the city's garbage. The hole was too narrow. His shoulders jammed against the rim of the stone. The soldiers cursed, yanked him back up, and dragged the body on foot through the Forum to the Pont Aemilius, the stone bridge over the Tiber. They lifted the corpse by its arms and legs, swung it once, and hurled him over the edge. The body hit the brown water, sank, and was gone. He was the only emperor in the entire history of the Roman state to be denied a burial, denied a tomb, and thrown away like an infected animal. The water had not even carried him out of sight before the Senate was already in session. They moved with the clean, unsentimental speed of men who understood that their survival depended on erasure. They passed a decree of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It was an imperial order to scrub Elagabalus out of the record of human history itself. Stonemasons climbed the arches and monuments scattered across the empire from Britannia to Arabia. They swung iron chisels and carved his name violently out of every marble inscription they could reach. The mint pulled thousands of gold and silver coins bearing his face out of circulation and melted them down into blank ingots. His statues were ripped off their pedestals and smashed into gravel in the public squares. The black meteorite he had dragged from the Syrian desert to the heart of Rome was quietly packed onto a cart in the middle of the night and sent back east, exiled from the capital forever. The men he had elevated, the dancers, the athletes, the lovers he had paraded through the streets as generals, were hunted down by the Praetorians one by one. They were pulled out of their villas and executed in the alleys. The Senate wanted every rotted limb of his administration sawed off before the infection could spread into the new reign. Julia Maesa survived the purge. She sat in the quiet of the palace, watching her 13-year-old grandson, Alexander, be wrapped in the imperial purple. She had fed her own daughter and her own older grandson into the grinder to keep her hand on the throne. She had won her game, but it was the hollowest kind of victory. The empire would carry the scars from this reign for generations. The story of Elagabalus is not a fable about a mad boy in a crown. It is a clinical autopsy of absolute power and the men who enable it. A 14-year-old psychopath did not break the Roman Empire on his own. The Senate broke it by kneeling to him. The Praetorian Guard broke it by selling their loyalty by the silver pound. The citizens of Rome broke it by watching in silence, year after year, as every line in the sand was erased. The true horror of this story is not the monster sitting on the throne. The true horror is the enormous, intricate machinery of a civilization that willingly dismantled its own laws, its own faith, and its own dignity, piece by piece, just to survive the mood swings of a teenager. When you build a system that funnels all authority into a single chair, you are not guaranteeing order. You are guaranteeing that sooner or later, a madman is going to sit in that chair. And when he does, the world will be forced to stand at attention and watch everything burn. Thank you for watching until the end. Subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who needs to see it. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Point your cursor at the video currently appearing on your screen. Click it and watch it right now to continue your journey of dark history knowledge.